Our next speaker is Stanley Kurtz. Stanley is a senior fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center in Washington, D.C. Mr. Kurtz is a key contributor on a wide range of issues such as education reform, the challenges of democratization of broad urban-suburban policies, and the shaping of America's left agenda. His articles have appeared in many journals, such as National Review Online, where I'm proud to follow him, and he's a contributing editor. He's also published 2 influential books on President Obama's political history and policy agenda, and Mr. Kurtz has taught at Harvard University and the University of Chicago. Mr. Kurtz, welcome to the American Dream Coalition.
Thanks so much. Thanks for having me. I'm embarrassed to learn that I'm maybe the only speaker without a PowerPoint presentation. So I'm going to ask you to get out your devices and Google up some interesting pictures. Actually, the problem seems to have been solved, and I do appreciate that. So please look over there. All right. So I'm here to tell you today that President Obama is not particularly a fan of suburbs. In fact, in Barack Obama's ideal world, suburbs really wouldn't exist. And I know that most Americans would find that hard to believe, but I say it because for nearly 2 decades, President Obama has been a huge supporter of a movement whose goal is to have city governments essentially swallow up and control suburban governments. And the idea here is to somehow find a way for cities to grab a hold of all that suburban tax money. So the bottom line is that President Obama is interested in redistributing the wealth of America's suburbs to the cities. If you go back to the history of some of these Saul Alinsky-style community organizers who trained and mentored Barack Obama all those years ago in Chicago, you'll find that they really didn't like suburbs. And in fact, their goal, their long-term policy goal, was in a sense, and I'll explain what I mean by this, to abolish the suburbs, to literally get rid of them, and I don't mean dropping a bomb on them, but to essentially undercut their political and economic independence. So why did these organizers feel that way? Well, they blamed the suburbs for the problems of the cities, because when people move out to the suburbs, they take their tax money with them. So these Alinsky-style organizers who trained Obama got together with some very clever and creative policy people and politics folks. One of them is named Myron Orfield. He's a politician and an academic from the Minneapolis-St. Paul region of Minnesota. And another is named David Rusk. He's a former mayor of Albuquerque, New Mexico. And together with Orfield and Rusk, a whole collection of community organizers, which, as I say, includes very much the inner circle that was around Obama at that time, came up with a series of strategies for undercutting the political and economic independence of the suburbs. And out of that came a movement which they called the Regional Equity Movement. Sometimes we just call it regionalism for short. Now, of course, as you've heard from Wendell Cox and others, there are many different sources for contemporary regionalism, sources outside the United States, historical sources within the United States. But the particular movement I'm talking about is pretty central to what regionalism is today. And certainly when it comes to the thinking and the policy moves that have influenced the federal government right now under President Obama, this is ground zero, what I'm talking about here. Another way you can think about it is, I know in the first presentation we had, there was a comment, well, you know, these numbers just don't add up. Why are folks doing this? They seem to have had an answer to begin with, and then they're finding whatever numbers they can come up with to make it come out according to that preset answer. Well, this is one big candidate for why a lot of people have this preset answer, this regional equity movement. Okay, so now the reason I'm here is because I put a book out recently called Spreading the Wealth, How Obama is Robbing the Suburbs to Pay for the Cities. And as I was doing the research for that book, I found out that not only was Barack Obama very much a charter member and supporter of this regional equity movement, but to this day, from the White House, the Obama administration is channeling a substantial amount of political and financial support to this regional equity movement. Not only the movement as a whole, but even some organizations run by the very same Saul Alinsky organizers who trained Obama all those years ago. So these policies don't tend to get reported on in the media. Americans really don't have a strong awareness of the kind of policies that are being discussed in this conference, even though the federal government has actually taken a very, very strong role through departments like Transportation, Housing, Urban Development, the Environmental Protection Agency, in pushing these regionalist policies. The big picture, what regionalism is, the whole philosophy behind it, really hasn't been communicated to the public by the Obama administration and certainly hasn't been reported by the media. And that's, of course, because this is all very controversial stuff. And even though the planning community very much partakes in these ideas and constantly gives hassles to folks like yourselves, politically, if the president were to start mentioning these sorts of things in a clear way in his press conferences or in a State of the Union address, there could be a serious political backfire. So we don't hear a lot about it. But, in fact, the Obama administration is working very hard to advance these regionalist policies. All right, so what is it exactly that the regional equity movement is all about? What do they want to do? Well, their initial idea was, and this is why I say abolish the suburbs, they literally wanted to get rid of the suburbs. And David Rusk wrote a book called Cities Without Suburbs. You know, what did he mean by that? Well, he meant that cities ought to annex the suburbs. You want suburban tax money? You want to be in control of suburban zoning? Just annex them. And that sounds crazy. But in fact, a lot of large American cities in the 1900s did expand through a policy of annexation. It was hard to hook up the infrastructure without that. But eventually, most state legislatures said, you know, we can't do this. There's a little thing called consent of the governed, and if you want to annex someone, they're going to have to consent to it. And so very quickly, the regional equity movement ran up against the fact that most states had made it illegal to forcibly annex the suburbs. But at least that revealed what they were all about, what their ultimate goal was. So instead, they came up with a series of strategies for achieving a kind of de facto annexation. What are those strategies? Well, you could think of it as basically a three-part set of things. The first one is find ways to either press people from the suburbs back toward the cities, or at least to stop people from moving out to suburbs, to block suburban growth and at least concentrate future growth into dense urban areas. And of course, we've already heard a lot about that. Wendell Cox was emphasizing the importance of these urban growth boundaries, which obviously a place like Portland has in the clearest way. But even, say, in Cleveland, in Northeast Ohio, that you can try to achieve an almost de facto urban growth boundary just by having your metropolitan transit planning organization start nixing the building of new highways that would ease transportation out to the suburbs or perhaps open up an area for future suburban development. So suburban growth boundaries, you know, the whole panoply of things that are being discussed at this conference, I'm sure, various kinds of fees and taxes to make it difficult and more expensive to drive. So drive people, force people back into densely packed cities is part one of the strategy. Part two of the strategy is take people who already live in cities, particularly the urban poor, and somehow get them out into the suburbs. How do you do that? Well, we've seen something like that in a place called Westchester County. Just out of curiosity, if you've heard of this controversy over Westchester County, raise your hand. Okay, that's pretty good. Although it's interesting that at a conference like this, it still was maybe only, what, 45% of the hands went up. This is, Westchester County is a suburban county outside of New York City in New York State. And the Obama administration, without going into too much detail, the Obama administration has very sharply pressed Westchester to build relatively high-density, low-income housing at its own expense. And even though there is no record of Westchester County, and it's not even asserted that Westchester County has been discriminating against anyone because of their race or ethnicity, nonetheless, using a highly expanded conception something in the Federal Fair Housing Act called Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing. And I'm going to get to that a little later in the talk in more detail. But using this notion of affirmatively furthering fair housing, the Obama administration has forced Westchester to build this housing, to change its zoning laws against its will, to pass something called source of income legislation, which would compel landlords to accept payment from government housing vouchers, such as Section 8 vouchers, which literally the federal government is forcing, under penalty of the county leader going to jail, they're forcing Westchester County to agree to change its own legislation, to change its own zoning. And the administration has promised to repeat everything they're doing in Westchester in many other suburbs throughout the country. And yet this is not well known. Hugely controversial. In fact, after the administration began to do this, Westchester's county government flipped from Democratic to Republican. People were so upset by it. So again, you see the potential political feedback of this. Okay, so part one of the strategy is to start pressing people to move in toward the cities, or at least to prevent new development in the suburbs and channel new development into densely packed cities. Part two of the strategy is to take especially the urban poor and somehow press them out into the suburbs. Part three of the strategy is something called regional tax-based sharing. And again, I'm curious, how many people have ever heard of regional tax-based sharing? Okay, that's pretty good. That's probably 65% of people, but still not everyone. We actually only see this policy of regional tax-based sharing right now in one place in the United States, in the Minneapolis-St. Paul region, which not coincidentally is where this fellow Myron Orfield I mentioned before is from. This is Catherine Kirsten's nemesis. And if you go, and Catherine, I'm sure will be talking about all this in her little breakout session after this. Minneapolis-St. Paul is really a center of the regionalist movement in the United States. So what is regional tax-based sharing? Well, it's a policy in which the state legislature forces all the municipalities in the Minneapolis-St. Paul region to kick in a substantial share of their tax receipts to a common regional pot. And then that money gets redistributed according to a demographic formula that effectively takes money from the suburbs and redistributes it either to cities or to some of the less well-off inner ring suburbs in that area. So literally they are taking and redistributing money given by taxpayers in a particular municipality to others. This is the ultimate goal of the regional equity movement. And it's important to note that even though we have an incredibly strong tradition of local control in the United States, constitutionally speaking, the local governments really don't have any status. All the powers not specifically delegated to the federal government by the Constitution here in the states. So technically you can go to the state and you can say, force the local government to do this or that, including forking over all of its tax money, and you can do it. Constitutionally, you can do it. So now, put these three policies together. You take people from the suburbs and you push them into the cities. You take people from the cities and you move them out to the suburbs. You take suburban tax money and you redistribute it regionally, and boom, you have, in a sense, abolished the suburbs. Of course, the political boundaries continue to exist, but with regard to what really matters, your economic and political control and independence, you have, in a sense, been eliminated. So this is the way that the regional equity movement came up with to get around the problem of annexation not being legal anymore. Now, if we look at the Obama administration, we see that it is enthusiastically pressing all of these policies, and it enthusiastically adheres to regionalism, and a lot of people in the Obama administration and the higher echelons are adherents of this regionalist movement. And of course, it's not as though this is never reported, but it appears in just a few obscure articles here and there. The American public really has no idea that this is a major policy aspect of the administration that we're not even debating nationally. So what is the Obama administration doing actually concretely? Well, one example is they are using the political resources and power of the White House to help to lobby on a local level for these regional tax-based sharing policies. Some of these old community organizers I mentioned have gotten together with the Obama administration, and they invite local politicians in, and they put them in the White House, very prestigious, and then they get a lecture from Myron Orfield or from David Rusk about all of these policies, but certainly including regional tax-based sharing. And so there's an attempt to build coalitions on the state level to put that policy through. And then I've already mentioned the Westchester County case, which the Obama administration has promised to expand. But there are a couple other very important examples I'm going to try to talk about before I run out of time, if you're not too entranced by these magnificent slides over here. One of them is called the Sustainable Communities Initiative, which is a kind of a partnership between the Department of Housing and Urban Development, the Department of Transportation, and the Environmental Protection Agency. And the idea here is to coordinate policy across these areas to advance these broader regionalist goals. So under the Sustainable Communities Initiative, there's a sort of core element called the regional planning grants. So right now there are hundreds of regional planning grants that have been financed by the federal government. They really would like to have had many hundreds more, maybe even thousands. But when the Republicans came in after the Tea Party victory in 2010, they were able to, at least for 1 year, cut off all of the funds for this program. I don't think they did it because they quite understood the regionalist philosophy behind it, but simply because it seemed like a place where money could be cut, and that was their brief. And so these regional planning grants go out. Now, they don't cost very much. You're paying people to plan something. And they don't seem, also, of course, Sustainable Communities Initiative Regional Planning Grant, it sounds like gobbledygook. That's another reason it doesn't get reported. Nobody quite grasps what's going on. But essentially, money is going to all the people that you don't like. All of the advocates of regionalism and smart growth in a given area get to come together, the politicians, the community organizations, and then they get a federal imprimatur. They get a bunch of money to hold meetings, and they come out with a plan that's just like Plan Bay Area. In fact, Plan Bay Area, although it was mandated on the state level by California state legislation, it has associated with it, if I'm remembering correctly, one of these federal Sustainable Communities Regional Planning Grants, which is putting additional pressure on Plan Bay Area to densify, to do all these things that don't seem to add up, that don't seem to make sense. And the grant is also going to community organizations, which then come to the public meetings. Okay, so Plan Bay Area's people are getting money from the federal grant. The grant requires them to partner with local community organizations. So the local community organizations come to the meetings that folks like yourself sit there complaining. And then they say, well, wait, we love this thing. And no one actually mentions that they are technically formally partnered with the people getting the grant, and they're actually getting money from all of this and stand to get more if the grant goes through. So it's really almost a kabuki theater sort of a thing. So these Sustainable Communities Regional Planning Grants technically don't have any power. However, when they are issued over the years between now and the end of the Obama administration, the Obama administration at that point will have the option of beginning to make federal aid of various sorts, transportation, housing, even education, if it wishes, conditional on local adherence to these plans. And we've already seen something like this in Plan Bay Area. Essentially, the Plan Bay Area folks have made it clear to the suburbs in the Bay Area that if you don't knuckle under and go along with this plan, you're not going to get your federal transportation money to fix things up. And so a lot of places aren't like California or Minnesota, which is another area where this is happening. They don't have state pressure to do this. So by having these Sustainable Communities Initiative regional planning grants, there is the potential to go and force what we're seeing in very blue state type areas like the Bay Area and Minneapolis, St. Paul, on many other areas in the country, if the administration decides to play hardball and start making federal grants conditional on this. And now the last big policy initiative I want to talk about, and this is really big and really important. Let me ask for another show of hands here. How many people have heard about the new proposed Housing and Urban Development rule of affirmatively furthering fair housing? Okay, still that's really maybe only 30% or less of the people here. This is going to be huge. And yet it's been kept under the radar. I still haven't seen a single, maybe I've missed it, but I haven't seen a single report in the New York Times or Washington Post on this extraordinary rule. What is this rule? Well, again, it uses this phrase, affirmatively furthering fair housing, which is a phrase from the Fair Housing Act, I think, of 1965. Now, traditionally, the affirmatively furthering fair housing has been interpreted to mean you don't discriminate against people because of their race or ethnicity. But now the Obama administration has an expansive new interpretation of this. And it goes beyond even a sort of affirmative action type of transformation. Instead of saying, not only do you have to withhold from discrimination, not only do you now have to actually start bringing people in according to ethnic and racial criteria, but it goes further than that. Now they're redefining fair housing as proximity to transportation hubs, to metro stops. They're redefining fair housing as proximity to areas with heavy employment, a lot of jobs available. So that, and we've seen this already beginning, say, in Minneapolis, St. Paul, where they have something called Thrive MSP, which is another one of these regional plans, again, mandated by the state, but which now overlaps with a federal regional planning grant. And what they do in these grants, and what they're going to do with the new rule, and what they've done a kind of run-through in Minnesota, probably, I can't say this for certain, but I'm guessing that Myron Orfield, who is behind this mapping technique, probably has a lot to do with this. They want every locality in the country to create a kind of a map. You need to map who lives where by race, ethnicity, and income. Income gets in here in a sneaky sort of way, and they develop a term called concentrated poverty. If you find an area of concentrated poverty where a number of people above a certain percentile, say 40%, is considered to be impoverished and they live together, steps have to be taken to disperse those people and move them closer to transportation hubs and business areas, or you won't get your community development block grant. You won't get all of the different sorts of housing aid. And when people get aid from the Department of Housing and Urban Development, they generally have to sign a form that says, we will take all steps to affirmatively further fair housing. That was always a pro forma thing before, as long as you didn't discriminate. But now that is being turned into a condition to map and then take remedial steps, which will in effect be trying to densify these areas along the lines of the overall regionalist movement. So this potentially is huge and hugely controversial, and at minimum the American public ought to be debating it, and they're not. But well, while I'm sure there are many ideological sources of all this, when it comes to the Obama administration, a great deal of it goes back to this regional equity movement. This is something that's crucially important to the president himself and to many of the people he's appointed in his administration, yet it's not known, it's not being discussed, and, but it's coming. And now you've heard it here. Okay.